What if one of the biggest forces shaping your life isn't your intelligence, your personality, or even your motivation, but something so subtle that you almost never notice it? Imagine waking up every morning believing you're making fresh decisions, carefully evaluating every situation. It feels like you're in control, but in reality, your brain quietly builds invisible shortcuts. These shortcuts save energy, reduce mental effort, and help you survive. Most of the time, they're incredibly useful. But sometimes, they also stop you from seeing opportunities, questioning old beliefs, or noticing that you've been repeating the same mistakes for years. This isn't manipulation. It isn't mind control. It's a completely natural psychological process that every healthy brain relies on. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating concepts in cognitive psychology, mental sets. Understanding it won't magically change your life overnight, but it might help you recognize why your thinking sometimes becomes trapped without you even realizing it. Picture a locksmith who has opened thousands of locks during a long career. One day, a customer brings in a brand new electronic lock unlike anything the locksmith has ever seen. Instinctively, the locksmith reaches for familiar tools and techniques that have always worked before. But nothing happens. The problem isn't lack of intelligence. It's that years of success created expectations about how problems should be solved. The brain naturally searches for familiar patterns before considering completely new possibilities. Psychologists call this a mental set. It's a tendency to approach new situations using strategies that worked in the past. Most of the time, this is incredibly efficient. Without it, every simple task would require enormous mental effort. Imagine relearning how to brush your teeth every morning or figuring out how to drive every time you entered a car. Mental sets allow experience to become useful knowledge. They're one of the reasons humans can master complex skills over time. The interesting part is that mental sets are neither good nor bad. They are simply efficient. Your brain is constantly balancing two competing goals. One is accuracy. The other is saving energy. The human brain represents only a small percentage of body weight, yet it consumes a remarkable amount of energy every day. Because energy is valuable, evolution favored brains that could automate familiar patterns whenever possible. Instead of analyzing every situation from scratch, your mind asks a simple question. Have I seen something like this before? If the answer is yes, it often applies an existing solution immediately. Most of the time, that's exactly the right decision. You can observe this in everyday life. Think about typing on your phone. At first, every letter requires attention. After months or years of practice, your fingers begin moving almost automatically. You no longer consciously think about each individual key. Your brain created a reliable mental pattern that frees attention for more important things, like the conversation itself. The same process happens while driving familiar roads, cooking favorite meals, or playing a musical instrument. Experience gradually reduces mental workload. However, every advantage has a trade-off. Because familiar strategies usually succeed, the brain naturally develops confidence in them. Over time, it becomes increasingly likely to interpret new situations through old experiences. This isn't stubbornness in a moral sense. It's simply how learning works. Imagine someone who has always solved math problems using one particular method. When presented with a new problem, they may immediately apply that familiar approach, even if a simpler solution exists. The old strategy isn't wrong. It just isn't the most effective one this time. Researchers have studied this phenomenon for decades using problem-solving experiments. Participants often become very successful using one solution repeatedly. Later, they're presented with new puzzles that can actually be solved much faster using a different method. Surprisingly, many continue using the old strategy because it's the first one their brain recognizes. This doesn't happen because they're incapable of creativity. Instead, previous success shapes expectations, making familiar solutions easier to notice than unfamiliar ones. This reveals something important about human thinking. We often imagine that perception comes first and interpretation comes later. In reality, interpretation begins almost immediately. Your experiences influence what captures your attention, which details seem important, and which possibilities your brain considers first. Two people can observe the same situation, yet notice completely different aspects because each person's previous experiences create different mental expectations. Education provides another interesting example. Students sometimes struggle when learning advanced concepts because earlier lessons were deeply reinforced. Imagine someone who spends years learning that every math equation has a straightforward answer. Later, they encounter problems with multiple valid approaches or situations where uncertainty remains part of the solution. The difficulty isn't intelligence. It's that earlier learning created expectations that no longer fit perfectly. Progress often requires expanding old mental models rather than abandoning them completely. Creativity offers perhaps the clearest demonstration of overcoming mental sets. Artists, scientists, engineers, and inventors frequently describe breakthroughs occurring after stepping away from a difficult problem. During rest, the brain sometimes relaxes its attachment to familiar patterns, allowing less obvious connections to emerge. That's one reason changing environments, taking walks, or sleeping on a problem occasionally leads to surprising insights. The brain isn't magically generating new intelligence. It's simply becoming more flexible in how existing knowledge is organized. Children often display remarkable creativity partly because they possess fewer established mental sets. Without decades of experience telling them how something should work, they're more willing to experiment with unusual ideas. Adults, on the other hand, possess enormous knowledge but also stronger expectations. Neither approach is inherently better. Experience brings expertise, while openness encourages exploration. Healthy thinking often depends on balancing both. One fascinating aspect of psychology is that awareness itself can improve flexibility. Simply recognizing that your first solution isn't always the only solution encourages curiosity. Instead of assuming, this is the answer, people begin asking, what else could explain this? That small shift changes how problems are approached. Scientists rely on this mindset constantly. Good science isn't built on defending old assumptions. It's built on testing whether better explanations exist. This principle extends beyond puzzles and classrooms. Learning a new language often feels difficult because your native language automatically supplies familiar grammar and pronunciation patterns. Musicians switching instruments encounter similar challenges because existing motor habits interfere with new techniques. Athletes changing sports discover that movements perfected in one activity may not transfer perfectly to another. In each case, previous learning remains valuable, but flexibility becomes equally important. Interestingly, experts are not immune to mental sets. In fact, expertise can sometimes strengthen them. Years of successful experience create powerful expectations about how problems should unfold. Yet many of the world's greatest innovators intentionally expose themselves to unfamiliar ideas outside their specialty. Reading broadly, collaborating across disciplines, or exploring unrelated hobbies introduces fresh perspectives that reduce the risk of becoming trapped inside one habitual way of thinking. This doesn't mean abandoning experience. Experience remains one of humanity's greatest strengths. The goal isn't to distrust your knowledge, but to remain open when circumstances change. Psychological flexibility means recognizing when familiar strategies continue working and when new situations deserve fresh thinking. It's less about replacing old habits than expanding your toolbox. A practical way to understand this is by observing moments when something surprises you. Whenever reality doesn't match your expectations, your brain receives valuable information. Instead of immediately forcing the situation into an old explanation, pause for a moment. Ask yourself whether you're seeing the situation clearly or mainly through the lens of previous experience. That simple question encourages curiosity without requiring perfect certainty. Modern life changes rapidly. Technology evolves, workplaces adapt, scientific discoveries reshape understanding, and cultures continue transforming. Mental sets help us navigate this complexity efficiently, but flexibility helps us continue learning. The healthiest minds aren't the ones that constantly reject old knowledge. They're the ones capable of updating it when evidence genuinely points in a new direction. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from cognitive psychology. Your brain isn't designed to be perfectly objective every second of every day. It's designed to balance efficiency with adaptation. Sometimes it relies on proven experience. Other times it benefits from slowing down, noticing assumptions, and considering alternatives. Neither mode is a flaw. Together, they form the remarkable system that allows humans to learn throughout an entire lifetime. The next time you solve a problem, make a decision, or find yourself saying, "This is how it's always been done," remember that your mind may simply be using one of its oldest and most useful tools. Mental sets are not barriers created to limit you. They're shortcuts created to help you. But every shortcut has a destination already in mind. And occasionally, the most interesting discoveries begin when you're willing to step off the familiar path and explore a new one.